of the second and third factors that you mentioned in the question, sort of economic calculations and some sort of spheres of influence type mindset that Trump approaches the world with, combined with what I think, and we heard Luke say it in the last panel, is among some in the Trump administration an ideological affinity for Russia, frankly. The Russian worldview and sort of what the rhetoric that you hear coming out of the Kremlin and the rhetoric that you hear from the far right in the US are extremely aligned. And so I think there are people in the Trump administration who actually think that we can partner with Russia and want to see Russia succeed. I think both of these motivations, the economic and the spheres of influence one, are misguided. Russia is a small economy, smaller than Canada's. It's never been recently in the top 20 trade partners of the U.S. Canada has been in the top 3 as far back as we've measured this, at least since NAFTA in the 90s. Russia actually economically, in the only thing it does economically, it's a competitor to the U.S., right? It is a hydrocarbons exporter. The U.S. is the biggest hydrocarbons producer in the world now, 22 million barrels a day. The Russians produce about 11. So even in the one thing that the Russian economy is good at, it's a competitor to the U.S. There's not a natural economic partnership to be had there. In terms of the spheres of influence thing, I would just say that, yeah, I do believe that that's part of the motivation. Again, I think it's misguided. Every great power concert is broken down into great power war eventually, we know this. And even the ones that we hold up as models, like the Congress of Vienna, 1814, we talk about 100 years of peace. It wasn't 100 years of peace. Europe was very violent throughout the 19th century. So I do think those are the motivations, but I do think they're also misguided. In terms of, I'll be a little provocative and say, I don't really think it matters if we have a Russia strategy or Russia policy, and that's because every administration comes in and they say, I'm going to fix a Russia relationship. In my adult lifetime, every single U.S. administration comes in and is going to fix the Russia problem or fix the relationship with Russia. And there's a reason why it's never fixed. My colleague Keir Giles, who's a great Russia analyst in the UK, has talked about the stages of U.S.-Russian relations being euphoria, pragmatism, disillusionment, crisis, reset, right? And if you think about that, we've gone through 3 of these at least since the end of the Cold War. And that's because the issues in the relationship are structural. It's not about, I don't think if you swap Putin out and Trump out tomorrow, that the relationship would change very much. Because they're structural. It's not about agency. It's not about who's president or who's in Russia or who's president here. I guess I would finish by saying, if we ever get around to crafting a durable Russia policy and strategy, it should be guided at least by 4 things that we habitually get wrong about Russia that I think any strategy should keep in mind. And I call these the 4 ways that we underestimate Russia. We underestimate Russia's definition of its minimal security interests. We tend to approach Russia as if it's sort of like a bigger, angrier France, right? That has sort of normal security interests and a normal bar for its own security. It doesn't. Russia's definition of its minimal security interests is so expansive that if we were to try to meet it, it would fatally undermine the security of all of Russia's neighbors and all of our European partners. So that's one. We underestimate Russian threat perceptions, frankly. Pete Swack, who used to be our defense attaché in Moscow, talks about Russian threat perceptions as real, perceived, and contrived. Russia, like any country, has real threats, and it has more than most because it's big and it's in a difficult neighborhood and it's sparsely populated in the south and east, and so it's got threats. And then they have perceived and contrived threats. So, and I think this is where we sometimes get ourselves cross-threaded with Russia and do things that accidentally activate their threat perceptions, is we often label, they do make things up, routinely. They make things up and they accuse us of doing things that threaten them when and they know in many cases we're not doing these things, or that if we are, they're not threatening to Russia. But then there are perceived threats. There are things that we look at and we say, there's no way the Russians actually believe that fill in the blank, color revolutions, NATO enlargement, whatever, is a threat to them. And I think in many cases they do. And since we conflate perceived and contrived threats, I think we often do things, and I'm not saying it's our fault that the relationship degrades, but we do things that play into Russian threat perceptions. Third thing we underestimate is their tolerance for risk. And this runs from tactical engagements in Syria all the way up to cheating on strategic nuclear arms treaties. We don't understand, and I think we don't understand this because we see ourselves, and the Russians do as well, as in the superior position in the U.S.-Russia relationship. We're the stronger power. We have more allies. And the way you mitigate that power differential is the less powerful party becomes much more risk tolerant, and that's what they've done. And they continuously put us on the back foot by taking risks that we would not, and by sort of, you'll hear people say escalate to de-escalate, sort of trite, but it is, I think, a component of what we're seeing with Russia. And then the final thing is, and I think Americans have not dealt with Russians a lot, miss this, the cynicism. We just don't get the cynical way in which they view the world, the cynical motivations that they ascribe to state behavior. And every time we appeal to the United Nations, international law, human rights law, norms of behavior, I think many Russians think that we don't believe any of that stuff either. We're just doing it. We're using it as a bludgeon or as a tool against them. And every time, frankly, the U.S. goes outside of those institutions, when it's more convenient to do so, we play into that Russian narrative, that really incredibly cynical narrative about state behavior. So I think that whatever we do in terms of a Russia policy or strategy, we should have those four things in mind sort of guiding it. And I'll stop there.
Great points, Bob.